Decision time. The Supreme Court begins its new session next week. We have a preview, including an abortion case that's being added to the docket. Impeachment investigation. New details into the probe into President Donald Trump's call with the leader of Ukraine. Vatican raid. Reports say 5 Holy See employees have been suspended as part of a probe into financial transactions. We're in Rome. And branching out. Pope Francis helps to plant a tree ahead of the Synod on the Amazon. We'll explain. On EWTN News Nightly for Friday, October 4th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for News from a Catholic Perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby. Supreme Court justices will weigh in on abortion. Today, the High Court agreed in their new term to take up a case centered around a pro-life law in Louisiana. It requires abortion doctors in the state to have hospital admitting privileges, but pro-abortion groups are pushing back. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi joins us with the details.
Wyatt, Louisiana has 3 abortion clinics, but the district court judge said 1, if not 2 of those clinics would close because of Louisiana's law. The appeals court rejected those claims, doubting any clinics would close. Still, in February here, the Supreme Court put that law on hold. Pro-life groups back the Louisiana law.
Jason, can you imagine the equivalent of cigarette companies being able to say that only cigarette companies and executives can argue about what's good for their consumers?
Louisiana Congressman Mike Johnson previously was the lawyer who defended his state's law.
The idea that a doctor who is performing invasive surgical procedures should need admitting privileges to a hospital within 30 miles is not an unreasonable restriction. It is directly related to women's health, and that's why that law was passed by the Louisiana legislature by an overwhelming landslide.
The abortion provider's brief to the Supreme Court says Louisiana could not point to any instance where a woman seeking an abortion would have obtained better care if her physician had admitting privileges. In 2016, the Supreme Court struck down a very similar Texas law. The High Court declared the admitting privileges requirement had a virtual absence of any health benefit. Since then, Judge Brett Kavanaugh replaced the court's decisive abortion swing vote, Anthony Kennedy.
The introduction of a new Supreme Court justice is a factor in this mix, and I think also you're seeing the court recognizing that abortion isn't going to go away as an issue. You know, Justice Thomas spoke to this in his recent Box versus Planned Parenthood writing, and he spoke about the court being duty-bound to address abortion.
They'll now address it this term, probably in the winter, with a likely ruling by June 2020, just 4 months before the elections. The justices still haven't decided if they're going to pick up 2 other abortion-related cases. Their term begins next week. But before that, on Sunday, Catholics will gather at the Cathedral of St. Matthew here in Washington, D.C. for the annual Red Mass. It calls upon the Holy Spirit to guide these public officials, and several Supreme Court justices usually attend. Here at the Supreme Court, Jason Calvi, EWTN News Nightly.
The White House is preparing a letter to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, formally objecting to the Democrats' impeachment inquiry. President Donald Trump is standing by his claim that Ukraine should investigate former Vice President Joe Biden and his son Hunter. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. Today I asked President Trump about the origins of these allegations of corruption he's made against Joe Biden and his son. The president is standing by his claim that his motivation has nothing to do with politics.
Mr. President, when did you first get the idea to investigate the Biden's activity in Ukraine? Who advised you to look into that?
We're investigating corruption.
Where did you first get the idea?
We're not investigating campaigns. I don't care about his campaign. As I said,
who advised you on it?
I didn't think, and I don't think Biden's going to win. All right, I don't think.
Overnight, House Democrats released text messages provided by U.S. diplomat Kurt Volker. They show Ukraine's newly elected president was encouraged to investigate Biden in return for a high-profile visit with President Trump. The president denies there was any pressure.
There's no quid pro quo, and there isn't.
The White House objects to the impeachment inquiry because it started without an official vote from the House. The president says even if Democrats win in the House, an impeachment conviction won't succeed in the Republican-controlled Senate. The president calls the impeachment effort a phony witch hunt that's helping his polls go through the roof and helping his campaign raise record amounts of money.
I got a call the other night from pastors, the biggest pastors, evangelical Christians. They said, we have never seen our religion or any religion so electrified. They say they've never seen anything like it. Churches are joining, hundreds of thousands of people. And you know, that's to a large extent because of you and your partner, the Democrats.
The White House is expected to miss today's deadline to supply more documents to House Democrats, who also warned that obstructing the investigation is an impeachable offense. Wyatt?
White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. The United States and North Korea will return to the negotiating table tomorrow. Officials from both countries are set to hold sit-down meetings in Sweden. At the top of the agenda, denuclearization. The United States is ready for another round with North Korea.
They want to talk, and we'll be talking to them.
Talking is good, but we have to understand their strategy, their objectives, and most importantly, as Sun Tzu said, we should attack their strategy.
President Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un have met 3 times to discuss denuclearization. Even though the negotiations stalled, the president appears optimistic.
Only time will tell. In the meantime, for 3 years, there's been no nuclear testing. We've gotten our hostages back.
These talks come one day after Pyongyang confirmed it test-fired a submarine-based ballistic missile.
I think it's an indication that they have no intention to denuclearize.
A source with knowledge of the planned meeting says this launch was not linked to the talks in Stockholm, but rather a response to South Korea for displaying its U.S.-made F-35 fighter jets.
We cannot go into negotiations and pretend that the nature of the regime does not have a very strong bearing on the denuclearization process and any settlement of political relations.
Last month, President Trump fired National Security Advisor John Bolton, a move that was applauded by North Korea. Bolton's first remarks since his exit were that North Korea would never give up their nuclear weapons voluntarily. Hong Kong's chief executive uses emergency powers to ban masks at pro-democracy protests. Carrie Lam says the decision was difficult but necessary.
I would say that it is a responsible decision that we have taken because of the much escalated violence that we have seen, especially in recent days.
The measure makes wearing a partial or full face mask punishable by 1 year in jail. So far, the new law doesn't appear to be intimidating protesters. Today, they took to the streets wearing facial covering. 2 of the demonstrators have filed a lawsuit to try to overturn the law. The former British territory has been the site of 4 months of pro-democracy protests. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo shows his support for Montenegro, the newest member of NATO.
Montenegro shares America's priorities across a range of foreign policy issues. We want to thank you for supporting U.S. resolutions at the United Nations and for complementing our diplomatic efforts regarding Syria, Iraq, Libya, and the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Secretary Pompeo met Montenegro's prime minister. The country is seeking closer ties with the West. It also wants to join the European Union. The main political rival to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in Canada has dual citizenship with the United States. Andrew Scheer says he is in the process of denouncing the U.S. citizenship. The Conservative also says he's pro-life, but adds he's not looking to reopen the debate into abortion in Canada, which is legal at all stages of pregnancy. Elections will be held later this month. Pope Francis has accepted the resignation of a bishop in New Zealand. Church officials say Bishop Charles Drennan was engaged in completely unacceptable sexual behavior with a young woman. The 59-year-old offered his resignation after an independent investigation into the allegations. No details about the relationship were released. The Vatican suspends 5 employees after a raid on the General Affairs offices in the Secretary of State. On Tuesday, Vatican prosecutors seized documents and electronic devices. It was done in connection to an ongoing investigation of the so-called Vatican Bank and Auditor General's office about past financial operations. One of the suspended employees, Tommaso Di Russa of the Vatican's financial watchdog, has been interviewed on EWTN News Nightly. Edward Penton, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register, joins us. Edward, this week we've been following all the developments in the investigation into Vatican finances. Bring us up to speed. What happened exactly?
Yes, well, there was a raid on Tuesday, Wyatt. The Vatican police raided the offices of the Secretariat of State and the offices of the Financial Information Authority, which actually monitors or safeguards the Vatican from money laundering. They raided those offices because of what Italian media have reported have been botched property deals, particularly one in London, mounting to possibly 160 million euros. So that was the reason for the raid, and it led to the suspension of 5 staff in the Vatican, the number 2 of the Financial Information Authority, and a Monsignor as well. So that's but also four lay people and a priest. So that's what happened this week.
What does all that, the raids, the financial information itself, what does all that tell us about the alleged corruption within the Roman Curia? I mean, how extensive is this?
Well, it does seem to be very extensive, and the fact that also on Thursday we heard that the Vatican has appointed a new chief prosecutor, if you like, the chief of the Vatican Criminal Tribunal, who's actually a leading anti-mafia magistrate in Italy. He's retired now, but he's had a good reputation of dealing with cases of mafia, and so he's been brought in, which I think underlines the problems that they're having to face here. But also, it's been called a judicial tsunami this week. People have been, reports rather, have been saying how serious it is, and also it follows the prosecution last year of a former president of the Vatican Bank. But all of this, we're told, is just a skimming of the surface, and there's a lot more to be done about cleaning up corruption, financial corruption in the Vatican.
You've been following all of these details all this week, Edward. Some of your sources that you've been speaking with are saying this is actually a good sign for the future of Vatican finances. First off, do you think that's true, and how so?
Well, on the face of it, it appears to be so. The Vatican put out an editorial today saying that this is a sign of the reforms that put in place originally by Benedict XVI and then followed up by Pope Francis are having an effect, a good effect. But as I say, there is a lot more to be done. And I put out a report earlier in July which talked about a whole different department, which hasn't been the focus of these latest raids, which is the department in the Vatican that deals with real estate. And there's various problems there, and reports that I found out that similar corruptions regarding also London real estate related to that department. So that also needs to be handled. So there's a lot more to be done. But as I say, they are making some progress with this. But I think we're just going to have to see how far this goes and whether these other issues, these other allegations are dealt with as well.
Of course, as you say, Edward, Pope Francis has wanted to reform the Vatican finances for some time now, and like you say, this seems to be a step-by-step process. Edward Penton, Rome correspondent for EWTN's National Catholic Register. Thanks so much for bringing us up to speed.
Thank you, Wyatt.
Coming up, analysis of the impeachment probe from an attorney who represents whistleblowers. Members of the House Intelligence Committee hear testimony today from the intelligence community's Inspector General as part of the impeachment inquiry into the president. The hearing has prompted a group of former inspectors general to call for whistleblowers to be protected from retaliation. In an open letter calling on Congress to protect the whistleblower at the center of President's impeachment inquiry, the 8 former inspectors general write, quote, "Whistleblowers are a vital component of oversight in addressing serious malfeasance, both within the government and throughout the private sector." Joining me now to take a look at the issue from a Catholic perspective is Brian Mahaney, a lawyer who represents whistleblowers around the nation. He was instrumental in the government's recovery of over $16 billion from Bank of America on behalf of taxpayers and homeowners in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. Brian, welcome into the program. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Why do whistleblowers come to lawyers like yourself for advice and representation? What exactly are they afraid of, and what are your conversations like with them?
That's a great question. So whistleblowers come for several reasons. Some feel that they've been ignored within the workplace. They could be government employees who see something wrong, report it up the chain, nothing happens. They could be working for a private company and they see wrongdoing. Typically, they try to fix the problem internally first, and only when they get nowhere internally do they turn outside? Outside could be directly to a government agency or to a lawyer. And sometimes roughly 20 to 30% face retaliation. And that's when they come, after they've lost their job or been demoted or something.
You called some of these whistleblowers that you represented heroes. Why do you use that term?
Because they're willing to stand up. They're taking a chance. When you're a whistleblower, you're sticking your neck out. So you're bucking the system, basically. The government or private companies typically have this mentality of don't rock the boat, don't make any waves, just play along with it. And these whistleblowers feel strongly enough, they have good moral convictions that say, no, what you're doing is illegal or what you're doing is wrong. And they're willing to step forward. As I said, sometimes 20 to 30% of the times they face some sort of retaliation for doing so.
I want to ask you about if there's any situations where you're concerned about a potential conflict of interest, because my understanding is that some whistleblowers in the private sector may receive financial compensation if their information leads to a prosecution.
Correct. I call that incentivizing integrity. Congress, all the way back in the 1860s, during the Civil War, realized that there's not enough government resources to go after all the wrongdoing. So we've incentivized people. We've said, hey, we'll pay you money. Government whistleblowers typically don't get that. They get protection from retaliation. Private sector whistleblowers get both protection from retaliation and in some instances, a reward.
Okay. How important is confidentiality in protecting the whistleblower?
It's paramount. So we see today the Ukraine situation, and the public sees the political whistleblowing, the government sector whistleblowing, and it's very polarizing. People have very strong opinions on one side or the other, but no one will step forward if they're going to be outed. People want that safety. They want to be able to know that somebody will listen without having their name blasted all over the media.
You use the term integrity. We've used the importance of confidentiality. How important is your faith to you as you approach this particular situation when you talk to whistleblowers and thinking about it from a moral perspective?
It's very important. So whistleblowers, they're trying to do the right thing. Believe it or not, most people aren't in it for the money, although there is money on the private sector side. Yeah. Almost every whistleblower that I've ever represented is doing it because they feel it's the right thing to do. And often the corporate culture or the government culture is such that loyalty to the business or loyalty to the agency, well, we have a higher duty. So if you're working, let's say, I'll use an example, working for a pharmaceutical company, and you know that the pharmaceutical company is producing a product that hasn't been inspected or has some sort of, it's been adulterated or something, you have a higher duty to report that, even if it's bucking the system, even if it's making waves.
Let me go back to the Ukraine, because you had cited the situation there with the presidential inquiry. Lawyers, of course, for the whistleblower at the center of that impeachment inquiry have said they're concerned for his or her safety. Do you think that potentially has a chilling effect?
Yes. So if you're a government whistleblower in the intelligence community, I think it has a huge chilling effect if you can't step forward without worried about being on the evening news. So we have no idea who this whistleblower is or what they've done or what their position in. We only know that they're in the intelligence community. I would be very worried. And if I were another whistleblower, potential whistleblower, I'd be afraid to come forward with all of the threats that have been out there. And the threats are on both sides, by the way. It doesn't matter what political party you are. Everybody has their own political agenda, and that's not the idea behind the whole whistleblowing program. The whole idea is that you can come forward to an inspector general, make your report, and it'll be treated confidentially and investigated, not become a political football for one side or the other.
So many important things to think about when you think about the issues of whistleblowers, both at the government and private sector levels. Attorney Brian Mahaney, thank you so much for sharing your legal insights and, of course, from a Catholic perspective.
Thank you very much. Have a good weekend.
Up next, a closer look at the U.S. economy as the unemployment rate reaches a 5-decade low. And the Holy Father celebrates the feast of St. Francis of Assisi. The U.S. unemployment rate has reached its lowest level in 5 decades. Hiring has been steady, which may help ease concerns that the economy might be edging closer to a potential recession. Employers added 136,000 jobs in the month of September. While economists expect hiring numbers to have been higher, the gains were enough to lower the unemployment rate to 3.5%. Jay Richards joins me now to take a look at today's numbers and what they mean for the nation's economy. He's host of the EWTN program, A Force for Good, and he's a professor at the Bush School of Business at the Catholic University of America. Jay, welcome back to the program.
Great to be with you.
Economists have been keeping a watchful eye as America's trade war with China has intensified. So what do you make of today's unemployment numbers?
Well, I think there's really nothing bad to be said about it. I mean, we're talking about historic numbers. They're as low as they've been actually in my lifetime and certainly in your lifetime. Especially note Hispanic unemployment numbers or employment numbers and Black American employment numbers are basically at historically low levels. In fact, most economists would say it's actually really hard to get below 3.5% unemployment, just because you always have some percentage of the population that's transitioning. So in terms of actual employment numbers, this is about as good as it can possibly get.
You mentioned Latinos. There's also people who don't necessarily have, or people without high school diplomas.
Yes.
Why is that they're doing so well in terms of getting jobs?
Well, I mean, that's the million-dollar question. I mean, part of it, I honestly think, is some government policies. President Trump's been very good, actually, on regulation. It doesn't get a lot of talk, but during the 8 years of President Obama, there was about $1 trillion added in terms of regulation to the economy. President Trump's actually been really good on that. Then there were, of course, the tax cuts in 2017. And I mean, the truth of the matter is that technology and innovation is happening at a record pace. And I think all that added together just leads to a kind of a remarkable economy.
Yeah, it is, everything's changing and so much technology involved in all this. Is today's job report a sign we can breathe a sigh of relief when it comes to a potential recession?
I'm not especially worried about a recession. I mean, some folks say, okay, well, maybe the number of jobs added to the economy in the last month are not that great. But when you get unemployment that's this low, you can't expect very large numbers of new jobs being added. It's still very good pace, especially compared to, say, the previous 8 or 10 years. We're on really, again, this kind of record-breaking growth. And so I don't think we should sort of expect that whatever economists sort of predict one way or the other, that we should sort of judge things in that way. I think what we need to look at is just people's actual jobs and things like median income, which are actually at record highs and are much higher than they were in the previous 8 years.
I'll get back to that in a second, but I want to ask you about some of the specific sectors of the economy. There were big gains last month in healthcare, which added more than 41,000 jobs. The weakest sector was manufacturing, which cut 2,000 jobs in September. What do you think that says about the direction of the U.S. economy?
I think that's actually a perfect example of what's happening in the economy. I mean, the reality is that in terms of productivity, manufacturing has never been better. But in terms of actual jobs, the sort of 20th century job in which there are lots of people working in a factory, that's just changing. I don't think there's anything we're going to be able to do about that. So I'd expect those types of manufacturing jobs to sort of slowly be waning. And then service jobs like healthcare to continue to grow. That's just what's happening in the economy. And so there's definitely going to be disruption, but when you actually look at the total numbers of jobs and the total people that have jobs, I think it's almost all positive news.
As we get ready for 2020, we've heard Democratic presidential candidates like Senator Elizabeth Warren say America's middle class is under attack. Heck, we've been hearing that for decades, haven't we, that the middle class is under attack, it's under attack. Is that an accurate assessment, though? I mean, how is the middle class actually faring right now in America and under this president?
I mean, it's actually doing really well. If you look at a median income, so that's the sort of very middle of the income spectrum, which is really what you want to look at. It's gone up over $4,000 per household since President Trump took office. In fact, that's about 4 times faster or larger than during the previous 7 years under President Obama. So it's a really record-breaking pace. This idea that the middle class is disappearing simply isn't true. It is true that it's shrinking as a sort of share of the economy, but about 2/3 of that is because more people are now in the upper classes rather than the middle class. But if you look at that median income, it's actually gone up at a remarkable pace during the few years that President Trump has been in office.
It's so fascinating to think about the numbers here and how all that's affecting our country. Jay Richards, host of the EWTN program, A Force for Good, and professor at the Bush School of Business at the Catholic University of America. Thanks so much for your analysis today.
Thank you, Wyatt.
Pope Francis celebrates the feast of St. Francis of Assisi by helping to plant a tree in the Vatican gardens. The Holy Father dedicated the tree to the upcoming synod on the Amazon. The holm oak came from Assisi, and the soil is from the Amazon. Cardinal Peter Turkson says the gesture was perfect for fall, the season of creation. He added humanity is turning a new leaf to help save the planet. Finally tonight, a group of Catholic nuns in Ireland has released a song based on a poem from their best-selling book. The Poor Clares of Galway released the book Calm the Soul in 2012. They say their new venture combines a traditional Irish love song with the mood of the poem, which is a call for the faithful to turn to God when they are feeling anxious.
People come to our monastery every day asking for prayers for different intentions, and not only do they come, they write letters, and it was really this that inspired the song.
The sisters say they released the song to coincide with World Mental Health Day next Thursday. Sister Colette says Calm the Soul touched people because it was simple. She says the combination of prayer and song helps put things in perspective. And we pray God will bless the sisters as they use their talents to bring people to Christ. And with that, we wrap up our newscast for tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll be back on Monday with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.